It was the kind of night that made windows shiver. The sky above the quiet town of Bellefontaine, Louisiana, wept in unrelenting torrents, its tears splashing against rusted roofs and cracked concrete. A hospital sat on the outskirts of the town like a forgotten thought, its faded letters blinking inconsistently above the emergency room doors. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with fatigue, echoing the exhausted breath of a place always running on half capacity and twice the need. Dr. Allison Vega had stopped counting how many nights she'd spent inside these walls. 35 years old and seasoned by loss more than time, she moved through the hospital like someone who had memorized its heartbeats. Her white coat had long since abandoned its crispness, replaced by the faint scent of iodine and unslept nights. Most of her colleagues had chosen cities' reputations and paychecks. She had chosen silence. And this small, fractured town. She was sipping cold coffee from a chipped mug when the door burst open with the kind of urgency that required no announcement. A security guard called her name, but it was the sound behind him that made her freeze. A baby's cry. But not just any cry, this one carried something jagged and edged too raw for its age. It scraped through the hallway like the wail of something ancient. Primal. Allison set her mug down, walked toward the noise, and turned the corner just in time to see a woman, young, soaked, trembling, holding a bundle of soaked fabric. Her eyes darted like a cornered animal, but they weren't what drew Allison's attention. It was the child, a baby, no more than 8 months old. But what protruded from the back of his neck, rising like a swollen, angry mound, made Allison's breath catch. A bulge, massive, distorted, pressing under the thin blanket like something trying to break free. The baby screamed again, and Allison moved. She didn't speak, not yet. She reached out gently, guiding the woman toward an exam room, nodding once to the night nurse who had frozen behind the desk. The hallway seemed to hold its breath as the door shut. The room smelled of damp fabric and sterile neglect. Allison peeled away the soaked blanket with hands trained in steadiness, revealing the child's face, flushed, soaked with tears, and feverish. The bulge behind his head seemed to pulse its surface, glossy, thin-skinned, and angry. The woman stood motionless in the corner, arms hanging by her sides. "What's his name?" Allison asked softly. The woman didn't respond. Allison looked up. "Ma'am?" The woman's lips trembled. Finally, a whisper, "Isaac." One word, like a plea, like a confession. Allison turned back to the baby. "Okay, Isaac," she murmured, brushing damp curls away from his forehead. "Let's figure out what you're trying to tell us." She ran a quick scan of vitals. High fever, elevated heart rate. The bulge was warm, no hot to the touch. There was no external wound, but the skin was stretched taut as if time itself had been pushed to its limit. The baby cried harder as she touched it, but even through the pain, his eyes caught hers, and Allison stopped. There was something there, a kind of seeing, not the blank gaze of a baby, but a depth that didn't belong to someone so small. It unsettled her. She had only seen that look once before in a mirror when she was 6 years old, left at a gas station with a note pinned to her coat. "She doesn't belong to me anymore." The memory flashed and was gone. Later in the staff lounge, Allison sat across from the woman Maria she'd finally whispered and tried to pull the story loose. "He needs imaging. Tests." "We have to know what this is," Allison said gently. Maria nodded. "Where have you been before this no answer? Did anyone tell you not to bring him in?" A pause, then a whisper. "They said, he's cursed." Allison blinked. "I didn't want to believe it," Maria added quickly, her eyes darting. "But when he was born—" The nurses looked away. One even crossed herself. "And you," Maria's voice cracked. I didn't know how to love him." The silence between them deepened. Not judgmental, just heavy, as if someone had let it settle there waiting to be named. Allison didn't press. She simply said, "He's staying. We'll help him. That's not a curse, that's just medicine." But, even as she said it, her mind raced. She'd seen abnormalities before. Tumors, cysts, congenital deformities. But nothing quite like this. And the way he'd looked at her, it wasn't just pain, it was memory, as if he'd lived this before. That night, long after Maria had curled up on a cot in the waiting area, Allison walked into the pediatric unit, now dark and hushed. She stood by Isaac's crib, watching him sleep. The swelling on the back of his neck cast an eerie shadow on the pillow. In the dim light, it looked almost sentient. Allison reached for a warm cloth, soaked it, and sat beside the child. With deliberate gentleness, she pressed it against the swelling her hand, cradling the base of his skull. He stirred. A whimper escaped his lips. Then, stillness. His breathing evened. The fever dropped slightly, and then it happened. A sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, a laugh. Soft, broken, but unmistakable. Isaac laughed. Allison froze cloth in hand, and she felt it, not just his skin under her palm, but a connection. Fragile, electric, as if she were holding more than a child. As if this moment, this contact, was some kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. The memory of her mother's back walking away from that gas station flickered again in her mind. And, for the first time in decades, Allison didn't feel alone in that memory. Later in her office, she opened her laptop and wrote a single line in the draft folder of her blog. A blog she hadn't updated in over a year. Some children don't arrive to be saved. They arrive to save. She saved the draft, closed the laptop, and wept. And that night, as Bellefontaine slept beneath the weeping sky, a doctor who had spent her life repairing what others abandoned and a baby the world had already decided not to love, slept under the same roof. Two strangers, two survivors, and perhaps two souls not as different as they seemed. If you've been moved by this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to our Healing Journey channel. Stories like Isaac's deserve to be heard and felt. Subscribe now to follow the next chapter of this powerful transformation. The morning after the storm, Bellefontaine awoke in silence. Rain clouds still hovered above like questions left unanswered, and the roads shimmered with thin sheets of forgotten rain. Inside the pediatric wing of St. Gabriel's Hospital, however, the quiet was deceptive. Dr. Allison Vega hadn't slept. She sat beside Isaac's crib. Her coffee untouched her hands, clasped her mind, alert. Hours earlier, she'd ordered a full imaging scan. Something about the swelling, its shape, its warmth had left a pit in her stomach that no textbook could fill. Isaac slept fitfully, his tiny frame rising and falling with each fragile breath. Maria hadn't returned to the room since midnight. Allison hadn't pressed her. Some wounds bleed longer in silence. When the door cracked open, Nurse Tasha entered mid-30s, efficient and usually unflappable, but today her brow furrowed. "Scans are ready, doctor," she whispered. "You'll want to see them." Allison nodded, stood and followed the nurse to the radiology office. The screen glowed in the dim light. And there it was. A mass smooth, encapsulated, but unnervingly large. It curled around the top of the spinal cord like a clenched fist pressing against the cervical vertebrae and beginning to strain into the upper spine. The tissue appeared benign, no markers of malignancy, but the pressure it exerted could explain the fevers, the persistent crying, the delays in motor development. Left untreated, it could crush his nervous system. It could take away his ability to walk, to speak, to breathe. Allison stared at the scan. Not in shock, she had seen worse, but in sorrow, because she knew what came next. The hospital's pediatric surgical capabilities were limited. The closest neurosurgical team capable of handling this was 2 states away, and that meant transport, paperwork, insurance, consent, and in Isaac's case, none of that existed. He wasn't in the system. No social security number, no insurance, no medical history. Barely a name, and babies like him, they fell through cracks like these every day. Back in her office, Allison pulled up the hospital's ethical protocols. She knew them by heart, but needed to see them again like rereading a poem you hate for being too true. No medical procedure shall be undertaken without legal guardianship, verified documentation, and institutional consent. Isaac had none of those. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling where a small brown water stain had formed like a slow, unhealed bruise. She had broken rules before. Quietly, carefully. But this would require something else. Something riskier. A knock on her door broke the thought. Maria stood there looking smaller than the night before, her eyes red, her hands twisting the hem of a borrowed sweatshirt. "Is he okay?" Allison motioned for her to sit. "He needs surgery. Specialized surgery." Maria flinched. "But he's just different." "That's all right." Allison softened. "Maria, the bulge isn't just cosmetic. It's pressing on his spinal cord. If we don't intervene, he could lose function. Or worse." Maria looked away. There was something in her silence, thick, heavy. Then softly she said, "I tried to leave him once." Allison didn't move. "I was still bleeding after delivery. I walked out of the shelter, left him by the stairs. But then I heard him cry, and I came back." The words fell between them like broken glass. "I thought maybe that was my punishment, that I didn't leave him fast enough. So now, he'll carry this forever." Allison inhaled slowly. "That's not how this works. Punishment isn't written into our biology. And this," she tapped the scan on her desk, "this isn't retribution. It's a medical condition, and it can be treated." Maria's voice trembled. "But how? I have no papers, no rights, I'm nobody." Allison met her eyes. "Then I'll be somebody for him." Later that afternoon, Allison called in a favor she'd been saving for years. Dr. Kenji Morita, neurosurgeon, pediatric specialist, old friend from residency. He now worked at a surgical institute in Georgia. She sent the scans, the case notes, a brief email with the subject line, "I need your help. No questions asked." Kenji called back within the hour. "I've never seen a formation like that," he said, voice low and grave. "But I've dealt with similar compressions. I can operate, but he'll need to be transferred here, and if I get him there, I'll waive the fees. We'll call it a consult. But your hospital won't like this, Allie. I'm not asking them." Kenji paused. "Then I trust you." That night, Allison filed a fake transfer request under a false name, John Doe Neonatal. She included her own ID as attending physician and next of kin. She knew the risks: suspension, revoked license, legal investigation. But Isaac's scan burned in her mind like a flare, and the sound of his laugh, brief, broken, and beautiful, lingered in her bones like a song half remembered. 2 days later, the transport ambulance was scheduled. Allison walked into Isaac's room where Maria stood by the window watching the rain. "He leaves tomorrow." Maria turned. "Will they let me go with him?" Allison hesitated, then lied. "Yes." Maria nodded. "Can I hold him tonight?" The question wasn't casual. It was sacred. Allison lifted the sleeping child and placed him in Maria's arms. And for the first time, Maria didn't flinch. She held him like someone relearning language. She whispered something in Spanish, soft, rhythmic. Allison didn't ask for translation. She understood the melody of remorse and love and everything in between. That evening, Allison sat alone in the chapel at the far end of the hospital, a place she rarely visited. It smelled of old wood and forgotten prayers. She didn't pray, not out loud, but she did ask silently for one thing. Let this be enough. Let this small act of defiance mean something. Let Isaac live. If you believe every life deserves a second chance, don't forget to subscribe to our Healing Journey channel. These stories matter because behind every scar there's a soul worth saving. Subscribe now to support and follow real-life stories of hope and redemption. The next morning arrived not with sirens but stillness. Allison helped load Isaac into the padded carrier. Maria clutched a bag with 2 changes of clothes and a worn-out photo of her grandmother. The nurse on shift didn't ask questions. She looked at Allison, nodded once, and stepped aside. Rules had been bent before. But this was something else. As the ambulance doors closed, Maria looked out the small window, her face unreadable. Allison stood on the curb, heart hammering. When the sirens finally echoed in the distance, she let her knees go weak for just 1 second. And then she turned, walked back inside, and braced for what would come next. The ambulance arrived at dawn, not with sirens but with reverence. Inside, the child slept. 8 months old, wrapped in cotton and uncertainty. Isaac Rojas was cradled in a world that had only just begun to acknowledge his existence. Maria sat beside him, her eyes unblinking, her fingers tracing the seams of the quilt Allison had slipped into the bag before departure. No one spoke. Some stories are written in silence long before language remembers how to hold them. The surgical center was bathed in quiet light when Dr. Kenji Morita first laid eyes on Isaac. He studied the scans like ancient scripture, and when he touched the boy's skull with gloved hands, he paused just a second too long. Not fear, not uncertainty, but awe. The mass had grown subtly in the past 48 hours. Pressure was increasing. Time was shrinking. "Prep him," he told the nurse. "This one, we do with all the gods watching." In the waiting room, Maria sat alone. She hadn't spoken since their arrival. Allison, forbidden from following due to breach of protocol, remained in Louisiana suspended for unauthorized medical action. The hospital had acted swiftly. An inquiry was launched. Legal advisors circled like buzzards. But none of that mattered to her now. What did matter was this sterile room, this chair, this breath, this memory. She clutched Isaac's birth photo in her lap, creased, faded, but sacred. In the photo, he cried. She remembered refusing to hold him that day. Too afraid, too ashamed, too broken. Maybe this is my punishment, she told herself, but that punishment was now in the hands of a man with steady fingers and a vow to cut it free. The surgery took 6 hours. The bulge, once a grotesque burden, was carefully separated from the nerve tissue. It bled softly like sorrow being drained. Threads of tissue that had curled around the spine like ivy were untangled, cauterized, severed with precision. It was delicate. It was sacred. It was success. When Maria entered the recovery room, Isaac was asleep. Tubes in his arms, a soft dressing on his neck. But the swelling was gone, and in its place a scar. Long, raw, beautiful. He looked small, but lighter. Maria leaned down, resting her forehead against his, and for the first time no part of her recoiled. She whispered, "Mi milagro," and wept. That night, Maria disappeared. She left behind a letter on Isaac's blanket. Dr. Vega. I'm not worthy of him. I carried him through fear not love. I gave him life, but I don't know how to live beside it. Please. If he has a chance at love, give it to him. Tell him I left to protect him from the part of me that still believes I should have let him go. Forgive me, Maria. Allison read the letter in her kitchen, the fluorescent light humming above like a question she couldn't answer. She had just returned from a disciplinary hearing. Her medical license was now under review, her access to the pediatric wing suspended. She hadn't slept. But she'd printed a photo from Maria's message. It was of Isaac, asleep after surgery. Eyes closed, mouth parted. The scar soft and silver in the hospital light. She pinned it to the bulletin board above her desk. Next to it she placed a card. He lived. That's enough. Weeks passed. Isaac remained in care. Social workers filed paperwork. Legal guardianship became an open question. Allison volunteered unofficially to watch over him. She read to him, sang to him, walked him through hospital halls like a quiet rebellion. He laughed more now, cried less, his body stronger, his grip firmer. And when he smiled, it was no longer broken, it was radiant. On a warm September morning, Allison held an exhibition. It wasn't grand. Just a converted community hall, white sheets pinned to brick walls. Photos hung like gentle ghosts, portraits of children who had fallen through systems and survived. She called it The Children We Forgot. At the center of the room, under soft amber lights, hung a large photograph. Isaac standing wobbly but upright, a bandage still taped to his neck. In his hand, a single sunflower. A small placard read, "The scar didn't break him. It released him." People came. Nurses, neighbors, strangers. They stood before the photo in silence, the kind only felt when something sacred has just exhaled. Toward the end of the event, as Allison refilled the coffee tray, a figure entered the room. Dark hair tied back, face down, shoulders hunched. Maria. No one noticed her at first. She stood at the edge, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Isaac's portrait. Tears clung to her lashes but did not fall. She walked forward slowly. Her hand reached out not to touch, just to be close. And then, a sound. A giggle. From behind, Isaac toddling in from the back, laughing as he gripped the edge of a chair. Maria turned. He saw her, paused, and then, without prompting, without fear, he smiled. She fell to her knees. Allison, watching from across the room, said nothing. She walked over, knelt beside them, placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. 3 of them. Silent, in communion. Not perfect, not resolved, but together. And sometimes that is enough. If this story reached a quiet place in your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our Healing Journey channel to support stories that remind us silence can be sacred. Scars can be beautiful, and no one is truly forgotten. Subscribe now. Be part of something real. Final reflection. In the days that followed, Isaac's photo was shared online. Thousands saw the boy with the silver scar and the sunflower. They called him the boy who smiled through the silence. Maria was never interviewed. Allison never sought credit. But the hospital lifted her suspension, quietly, without apology. Because some acts of healing cannot be measured. They must only be witnessed and remembered.